everybody. Welcome back to Paideia today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we are back talking about Milton, getting back into Paradise Lost and the actual substance of the text itself. And we are, as promised, looking at Book 2 today, and very likely Book 3 as well. And Dr. Masson, can you set the stage for what we see in front of us here at the beginning of Book 2? We're into some strange circumstances with Milton.
Yeah, so we left off last time with some rather stirring speeches by Satan on the floor of hell, and some declarations which were flat lies, nonetheless famous, that it's better to reign in hell than rule in heaven, although he does not reign in hell for that matter. Or that the mind is its own place and in itself can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell, that sort of thing. So this idea that he is in control of reality, which is contradicted by the fact that he cannot even control his flight, as we shall see in Book 2, when he escapes from the floor of hell and flies up towards the gates of hell. So there's a lot of bombast and rhetoric on Satan's part, rhetoric that is quite admirable in many ways and stirring stuff. But I think we questioned whether Milton intended us to see him as quite so admirable as the Romantics do. But we concluded Book 1 with the construction of Pandemonium, the house of all the devils. And note that the Pandemonium has a sense of noise and discord, as opposed to the harmony of the celestial spheres and the music of the spheres and so forth. But there's a council here in hell, and there's a debate amongst Satan and other devils about what is to be done. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that council entails and who the actors are?
Yeah, I think you do a good job of setting up the circumstances, the setting, and not just the physical setting, but above all, the sort of psychological setting in which this first divine council occurs. I just want to touch on a couple of points that you just mentioned there. We start amidst a welter of posturing and lies. And this is almost a hyperbole, a cliched hyperbole of how many of us think politics, modern politics, tends to work well. Politics, apparently in hell, are a little different than that. So there are lies everywhere. Lies, of course, being the absence of truth. So truth is a steady state, and into that, as with, more broadly speaking, sin, you have an interjection of falsehood, a deviation from what is to what is said to be, on the other hand, by Satan, who is the father of all these things, of course. Second of all, we have to take careful note, I think, of the note that, as you say, this is pandemonium. This is the realm of discord and noise and audible chaos. The debate is going to be sort of grounded, centered, couched in this kind of chaos. I was thinking of this just the other day when I was watching a debate in the House of Commons up here in Canada. And everyone was speaking over everyone. There was derisive noise in the background. I couldn't make out what was being said on either side. And I thought to myself, wow, this is not dissimilar in some senses from pandemonium. But as you say, we in this context, we encounter a divine council. And as we mentioned last episode,
Infernal council.
Yes, an infernal council. It's not quite, well, I suppose it's divine, semi-divine, anti-divine, call it what you like. But in any event, it's unusual that the first divine council that we encounter is this infernal one. So this is unusual within the broader ambit and traditions of epic. And as you say, the job of the council is quite simple in one sense. What is to be done? How do we move forward here? And there are many different suggestions that get thrown forward by these various fallen angels as to how they should proceed. And the first really strong opinion that we get, it comes from the demon Moloch. Moloch essentially says, we have lost here. We are what remains. We are the broken remains and what have you. And the way forward here is to hurl ourselves in wild, hopeless warfare against the heavenly hosts, against God himself, until we are cut down. It is essentially a suicide charge. It is a bonsai charge. It is a suicide bomb, if you like. Call it anything you like. But this is, I argue oftentimes to my classes that this is one of the two sort of almost opposite responses to those who are cut off from hope, for those who are completely immersed in absolute despair. If you no longer have that hope, if you are completely given over to despair, if you have lost all your self-respect and status and all these sorts of things, you will respond in one of two ways. You will either respond energetically with a burst, which is oftentimes highly nihilistic, some kind of burst of violence. It could be social violence, spiritual violence, physical violence. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it does not anticipate you. In fact, it desires for you not to make it out of the other end of this crazy charge that you're involved in, whatever it is that you're charging at. And this is a hallmark of the infernal realm, I would argue, that nihilism is always sort of on the agenda at some point, usually at the far end of things. And that's what Moloch wants to do. And it's an insane suggestion, but remember, as we said in the last podcast, this is hell. Reason has no place here. Unreason is the very air they breathe. Madness is the very air they breathe. So in a mad world and in a mad council like this infernal one, of course, suggestions, insane, nihilistic, violent suggestions like this are going to crop up. It's in its inverted way, it's predictable.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a response to what Moloch has to say, which it comes from Belial. And this entails the opposite extreme response to being cut off from God, being cut off from hope, being cut off from goodness himself, which is to curl into a ball and do nothing, go catatonic, as it were. It's what I tell my students is that it's the philosophy of nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. And spiritually speaking, that's what Belial is counseling. And again, I'm sure many of our listeners could cite various instances where they have seen this kind of psychological tendency played out, whether that be in Christian circles or more broadly in secular circles or wherever it might be. You're to create as few ripples as you possibly can. But again, it's unclear what Belial hopes to achieve with this policy of non-interference and so on and so forth. Did you, by the way, Scott, did you want to feed into either of those two positions?
No, I mean, Moloch says his counsel is open war.
Yeah.
Have at them.
Right.
Belial, as you put it, sounds much more like the politician. And so he talks out of both sides of his mouth, and he counsels in the end. Who knows? It's unclear. Let's sit and let's talk some more, and let's circle around and let's do nothing. So it is, as you say, the council. It's unclear what the council is. I think at that point, there's also, is it not also the case that Mammon speaks here and suggests that they dig down and see if there's some gold down there?
Yes, that's the next step. That's the next part of the debate. Mammon gets stuck in with his bizarre suggestions, but of course, all you're going to get are insane, bizarre suggestions in this council here. By the way, before we leave Belial behind, he says basically, don't do anything more because God may punish us more.
Right.
And that's his starting. That's his thesis, if you like.
Yeah.
Notice that is not repentance, right? That is not repentance. He's afraid of mere consequences. He's not concerned about justice. He's concerned about consequences, which is very different.
No, it crosses none of their minds that they should repent.
No, it does not. Then, as you say, along comes Mammon, and Mammon wants to build hell into a sort of a heaven. He wants to dig down, as you say, find the riches of the bad place which your punishment has condemned you to. That's what he's looking for, the best of a bad situation. It's a limited world in which we now live, essentially, argues Mammon, let's make the best of it. And of course, this aligns quite nicely with the speech that had already been given by Satan about making a heaven of hell and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
It set Mammon up. So Mammon actually comes up with, in my view, of these three suggestions so far, the most viable. I'm not to say that it is viable, not at all, but it's more viable than Belial or Moloch's position thus far. And again, you can align Mammon's position, his strategy for moving forward, with a very sort of universal human tendency. It's a limited world. Let's do the best we can with what we've got. And that was, to some extent, the future context to Paradise Lost, because of course, as we move into the 18th century, this becomes the dominant intellectual position for many of the greatest thinkers in the English Enlightenment. That the world is what it is. Men are basically good. Let's make the best of, what we have here and see if we can just muddle by. And of course, this leads some people to deism and things like this later on.
Mm.
So that's Mammon's position on this.
And
But
he is
of course,
applauded for it.
he is applauded for it.
Such applause was heard as Mammon ended, and his sentence pleased, advising peace. For such another field they dreaded worse than hell. So much the fear of thunder and the sword of Michael wrought still within them, and no less desired to found this nether empire, which might rise by policy and long process of time in emulation opposite to heaven.
Yeah. So this is an attractive idea to these people. And again, ultimately, if you think about it, it is doomed, it is hopeless. But of course, as I said at the beginning, this is the realm of that.
Well,
Also
remember, this is something we said last time as well. Hell is the absence of not only God, but of good. So the
yeah,
idea that they can build an empire of anything good in hell, absent of God and absence of his goodness, is, as you say, the height of insanity. It's impossible, an impossible option for them. But they so fear God that they are willing to seize on this delusion. And then, of course, Beelzebub speaks.
yeah. Well, we set this up last time in talking about how Satan is not just the father of lies, but that one of his primary victims is himself. He is the victim of his own deception, and he buys into it. And again, I think this is quite an astute observation psychologically by Milton. I think all of us, again, know people who are prone to this, and we may see this tendency dangerously sometimes in ourselves if we're not cautious and prudent. I'd also like to point out here that Milton was around a lot of debate in his life.
Oh,
And
yes.
so setting up a highly artistic debate like this is effectively, in some ways, in Milton's backyard. He's very, very used to this kind of a circumstance. And so he's taking, I would imagine, a keen amount of delight in writing this scene as he's writing this scene. But then, yes, Beelzebub speaks. And he has a suggestion. He's primed, this fellow. And that's
Yes.
that they locate the favored creature of God, this thing, mankind, and that they corrupt it, that they destroy it, that they bring it low. This is effectively locating, this is equivalent to locating the loved ones of your target, avoiding your target, and rather striking at his or her loved ones around them in order to harm your main target.
So he's a terrorist.
Yes, essentially. And so of course, in our world, when this sort of horrible thing happens, it's done because if you go directly for your target, well, then your target's eliminated, but your target doesn't suffer, and that's the objective here: is to create suffering, not elimination.
Because they can't eliminate.
Yeah, but exactly. This is the point with God. With God, they cannot eliminate him. It's not that they don't want to eliminate him. They can't obviously eliminate him. So they have to strike at what they can actually do damage to and wound God thus. So of course, that is the plan going forward, and Satan moves into action to effect this. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I just a little bit, and it's a really interesting point that you make, and really it's in keeping with, again, Milton's portrait of evil in Paradise Lost in general, which is that evil does not exist onto itself. It is the privation of good. It's the absence of good. And what it is, and it doesn't exist on its own even. It exists only on the beneficence of God. The fact that they still exist suggests that God allows them to exist. And so what evil does is it twists and perverts and to some extent, yeah, and that's all it can do, is to twist the good, but it can't actually create any thing unto itself that we might call evil. There's no evil things per se. These are good things. These rebel angels, these are good things that are perverted, and their actions are perverted, so they twist things. And that's consistent throughout Paradise Lost. So I see online people talking about Milton in his portrait of good and evil, and he blurs the lines between good and evil, so they say. This is the most absurd take on what Milton is doing here, and it's theologically ignorant, because he is doing exactly what any Orthodox Christian would do in their portrait of evil, which is to suggest, as I've said, that evil is the privation of good. It's not that there is a good side and a bad side. It's that there is only good, and evil is a twisting of that. So there is only one thing, and everything else is a distortion of that. That's his portrait here, but that is not a blurring of the lines. Milton does think that there is such a thing as good. It's real good. And there is such a thing as evil. It's the twisting and perversion of that. But he's not blurring them, nor suggesting that they are degrees of the same thing. That's pantheism. That's pantheism. That is an explicit heresy. And but I'm reading this online, taught by universities.
Yeah, it's this is a very old standard Orthodox theological position. Augustine talks about it. A number of other of the church fathers talk about it. As you mentioned, C.S. Lewis mentions it in his preface. And it was an extremely influential notion to his friend, especially creatively, J.R.R. Tolkien, who essentially embodied that theological principle in the creation of his realms in Middle-earth, in the Lord of the Rings series, and to a lesser degree in The Hobbit.
Right. Note how he talks in that work about evil being a realm of shadow. A shadow is something you only see caused by the light.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's an absence of the light.
Correct.
To some degree.
Right.
And so later on, one of an important contributor to this conversation about the nature of evil immediately in the wake of Milton is Alexander Pope. And he says at a certain point in his essay on man that whatever is good. And you might think to yourself, wait a second, I know a lot of things which are emphatically not good. But of course, if you read that line in the context of what you and I were just talking about here, then actually, no, he does have a standard Orthodox point to make when he makes that assertion.
He has a particular understanding of what being entails.
Yeah, because remember, God's fundamental characteristics, as you and I have discussed them in previous podcasts, are the transcendentals. These are the interrelated qualities without which God is not God. So God is love himself. He is the very essence of it. And all instances of love which happen in the course of time are merely echoes of that good aspect of God, of love himself. He is justice himself. He is truth himself. I mean, there's a lot of debate as to which characteristics must factor into the transcendentals and which do not. But there is, as it were, kind of a Venn diagram, and we can all basically agree on certain things, certain qualities. And one of these, and this is the important point here, one of these is God is beingness himself. And that's, if you think about that from an ontological position, that's a very, very interesting assertion, because then whatever is comes out of that. And so if something is, then it is, it conflates with goodness himself. I mean, all these qualities imply the other qualities that are in them. To be just is to be good is to be loving is to be true, and so on and so forth. And so that which shares beingness from God is good by way of extension. Then you take that in this realm here that we're talking about, you twist it into something which is not of God's nature anymore. And yeah, now you have evil, to be sure. but understand that it's merely a perversion of what is as created by God, who is beingness himself.
Which is why why Satan and the other angels are referred to as having a good nature.
Mhm.
And so we need to understand what is meant by that word nature. And the word nature isn't mean that they're really good guys and they're just misunderstood. That's that might be their take on it. That might be their perspective, although even they don't believe that.
No.
But that's not what Milton means by nature. Milton means by nature that that God created them in a certain way, and because they still exist, that nature exists. Nonetheless, he insists that their will is evil, and their will, like if their nature no longer existed, they would no longer exist at all. They would not. So their nature, although good, is perverted by their evil wills, and their wills then are turned against God, adversaries of God. He's called Satan, he's the adversary, right?
Yep.
And furthermore, the devil, the diabolos, he's there and he slanders and so forth. That's what he uses his speech for. So all of these things are true of the devils here and their counsel. But I think we need to say that, and I thought it was really important based on what you said there to state that, because I am reading online and I've heard others say that Milton recasts our knowledge of good and evil and presents it in such terms that he blurs the boundaries between them. He most emphatically does not.
No.
His contemporary commentators do that in their ignorance, and one might say perhaps their malevolence, but I think that might be going a bit too far, although it might not be either, but it's certainly ignorance.
I think also this conversation, this aspect of the conversation, dovetails elegantly into this other question of beingness. So will and being, we've got these two sort of features that we're looking at here. As you say, or as you said before, when God says to them, you must not eat of the fruit of the tree, the point he's making here is his will is for them to align their will with his will. So there's kind of an elegance to that too, I suppose. But insofar as Satan does not do so, insofar as the fallen angels do not do so, they do not align their will with the will of God, and they're free to do that, as you say, and because that opens up the event horizon for goodness itself. And this in turn perverts the beingness, the nature, if you like, that God has created them with, and it twists them into shapes that are against God's will in turn. So in the sense, being is perverted by a perverted will first. And so he starts with the will and then he moves into beingness. And I think that, again, that whole sort of construct is, there's a beautiful symmetry to it that Milton works in here.
Right. And
So,
it's at the same time, and we'll go back to this, let me just final word. At the same time, the rebellion against God enacted by those that are his inferiors, in this case the devils, results in a rebellion against their own nature by their own bodies. So they are no longer capable of doing what they once did. They no longer look as they once did. And that Satan, for all of his vaunting and claims to be an angel, an angelic being, no longer has those capacities that he once did. He can't even fly straight, as we're going to see when, as I said, when he leaves the floor of hell, he's veering about over the course of hell, much like the town drunk on a Saturday night from the sounds of it. He's all over the place. He can't even control himself, let alone be what he vaunts himself as, namely the king of hell. He's not that even.
And again, I think that makes the good point that insofar as their will has twisted their beingness, they become, as you say, the enemy of who they were designed to be by God. And so all of a sudden, Moloch's suicide charge, his nihilistic streak, begins to make a little more sense in its own upside down, negative, inverted sort of a way. He is the enemy of who he is, and so he's going to not only conduct warfare against God and his hosts, but indeed against himself.
Yeah, that's a great point.
He is his own worst enemy, to get into the cliches here, but now, of course, in a much more existential sense.
Yeah, these days we talk about addictions and so forth having a similar self-destructive bent, but yeah, great point. Yeah. So you go back what you were saying, we left off with Beelzebub and his aim to pervert mankind. And you suggested maybe he was put up to it, and that might be true.
Yeah, the whole thing seems relatively scripted. And I remember encountering this when I first began learning about Paradise Lost. Um, I had professors who, as it were, had some skin in the game. They had their own agendas and what have you. And this was one of the first things that I heard asserted about this point in the debate, that indeed the whole thing was rigged right from the very beginning by Satan. He knew where the conversation was going to go. And Beelzebub is his inside man who was going to put this forward here, and that this is how it gets done. And then Satan, of course, piggybacks off of that and seems to be not the one putting forward the plan, but actually just responding to something that somebody else said. This is a common, if this is indeed the case, then this is a very common political strategy that you encounter,
Sure.
where some individual is put up to the dangerous suggestion of the way forward, and then the person who really orchestrated that steps in and says, "Oh, that's a great idea. Let us all try your great idea. If it fails, it's on you. And if it doesn't fail, well, I was the executive officer and I made it all happen, so I'll take all the glory." And the person who put it forward, Beelzebub, of course, there's no way he can possibly ultimately benefit from this. He can only lose if this all goes sideways. Did you want to say more about that?
No, other than that, at that point, so Satan praises them for their wonderful debate. What a wonderful discussion this all was.
This has been so wonderful, and thank you all for your opinions. They're all valued by us.
I really treasure them. I'll never forget this day. And at that point, he then, you've judged well ended long debate, synod of gods. He calls them a synod, which is of course an ecclesiastical term, which Milton's got a little bit of obvious a barb to that, to church councils. And like to what ye are, great things resolve, which from the lowest deep will once more lift us up in spite of fate. He keeps referring to fate rather than God's will, of course, as if this were an arbitrary, random, who knows what was going to happen type thing. So he keeps referring to fate. This is not Milton suggesting that there is such a thing as fate or that he believes in it, but rather it is satanic to believe that things are totally arbitrary and without meaning or purpose. But he says, but who's going to do all this? So this is a great suggestion. We're going to pervert him. Who's going to do this? And he asks the pointed question to which he knows the answer. Who's going to do this? And there is a silence and astonished dismay. None among the choice and prime of those heaven-warring champions could be found, so hardy as to proffer or accept alone the dreadful voyage. Till at last Satan, whom now transcendent glory raised above his fellows with monarchical pride, conscious of highest worth, unmoved thus spake. And then he offers to do it for them. I'll go. And of course, then he gets the applause.
Yeah.
But there's silence there. Now I say this because in the speech then in heaven, we're going to find that the Father similarly asks the whole host of heaven who will offer himself for mankind's transgression, and there's a similar silence. So there's a dramatic parallelism going on in the two councils. But I found it really interesting at the outset that you said that this was a council of the gods, because of course they're not gods in the sense that they're devils. On the other hand, the paradigm for epics is to begin with the council of the gods. And we get that in the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Aeneid and so forth. And we get different sides debating. Here, there are still two different sides debating, but they take place in different books, such as the length of the debate. And they're also not together debating. They're separate councils.
Yes.
But you could still see them as a council of the gods. One's just taking place in hell and the other's taking place in heaven. I've never thought of that before. And that's an interesting proposal. Not that you're saying that they are gods or that you're
no,
but it's that convention in a sense.
Yeah, let's call it, for lack of a better term at the moment here, there are two supernatural councils, one of them infernal, one of them holy and divine. And as soon as I like the fact that you mentioned the fact that there's a similar question posed met with a similar awkward silence. Leave it to Milton to empower awkward silences poetically. But again, what this sets up is a whole series of dynamics that Milton's original audience certainly would have known, is that all of a sudden I've got a second council, therefore I have a great standard literary opportunity for repetition and variation. One more
Yep.
time.
Yep.
And that just really empowers the reader to make a lot of connections on his or her own steam, own powers of intellect and things like that. And we're going to hopefully get into some of that as we move into book 3.
Yes, but before we could do that, let's look at the famous scene, the another sort of companion scene to that, which we'll see in book 3, and that is the wonderful family reunion, which takes place in hell between Satan and two other beings. And let me just describe this. I'm going to read the passage because I think at least something of it. So Satan goes off and he explores his flight, and he's all over the place, and he's compared to various entities. But then he sees in his sights around line 648 the gates of hell. And before the gates, there sat on either side a formidable shape. Now you can see Scylla and Charybdis there, like from the Odyssey, but and Milton will make allusions to classical horrors as well. But let me go back to this. On either side a formidable shape. The one seemed woman to the waist, and fair, but ended foul in many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast, a serpent armed with mortal sting. About her middle round a cry of hellhounds, never ceasing, barked with wide Cerberean mouths full loud, and rung a hideous peal. Yet, when they list, would creep, if aught disturbed their noise, into her womb, and kennel there. Yet there still barked and howled, within unseen. Far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore. Nor uglier follow the night hag, when called in secret, riding through the air she comes, lured with the smell of infant blood, to dance with Lapland witches, while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. That's the one figure. The other shape, line 666. If shape it might be called, that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called, that shadow seemed, for each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head the likeness of a kingly crown had on. Satan was now at hand, and from his seat the monster moving onward came, as fast with horrid strides. Hell trembled as he strode. The undaunted fiend, what this might be, admired not feared, God and his Son except. Created thing not valued he, nor shunned, and with disdainful look thus first began. Whence and what art thou, execrable shape, that darest through grim and terrible advance thy miscreated front athwart my way to yonder gates? Through them I mean to pass, that be assured without leave asked of thee. Retire or taste thy folly, and learn by proof, hell-born, not to contend with spirits of heaven. To whom the goblin, full of wrath, replied, Art thou that traitor angel? Art thou he who first broke peace in heaven and faith till then unbroken, and in proud rebellious arms drew after him the third part of heaven's sons, conjured against the highest, for which both thou and they outcast from heaven are here condemned? I could go on and on. I would like to go on and on. It's a fantastic dialogue, goes back and forth, and he says, and call yourself the king of heaven. And he says, when you're in fact, I'm the king, wear the crown, and you're my drudge, and you will not go and get back before I whip you back. And because what we have here is death. So we have this reunion of Satan, sin, and death, and at the end of that comes a third figure, and that was the woman, and the woman then calls out to the two of them, Father, what are you thinking of? And Son, what are you thinking of? The three, like, so Father and Son, and at the same time he is the father of the Son. So there's not an adulterous, an incestuous conduct and action that's taken place. Furthermore, he gives birth to her out of his side and so forth. So there's references to Zeus and so forth. So all of that there. But let me not get ahead of myself here, and because I've said a great deal just in quoting this passage, a reference to death as in line 666 as being having no shape, or a shape it might be called the shape had none, and similarly substance might be called that shadow seemed. All of these allusions to the very theological portrait of death that we talked about earlier on. Did you have something
And
to say on that, Bill? I have so much to say, but
yeah, oh, actually, just a couple of passing points which are not terribly important. One of which is that as you were reading that, I don't know why I didn't see this before, but we were talking about Tolkien, and maybe that's why I'm making the connection now. This thing sounds overwhelmingly like the Balrog and Fellowship of the Rings.
I always make that point.
Yeah, and I've never heard that said before, but it occurs to me as almost obvious now. We have also obviously a deeply unholy trinity here.
Yes.
So again, if we're looking for opportunities for repetition and variation, here we go. And so the richer we can make our understanding of not just these three, but the relationship between these three, and you were alluding to that already, the more profitably we're going to be able to appreciate the Holy Trinity that we're about to encounter on the other hand. And so here a detailed close reading really will serve us well, I think. But that's really all I want to say. You've got more to say here, and I don't want to interrupt it.
Yeah, but I don't want to talk too much about it because we will never get to book 3. This passage and the description of death is cited repeatedly in the 18th century in aesthetic treatises when they're talking about the sublime. It's this passage and passages like it when it describes hell, and it's what if light it might be called and so forth. So, or rather, no light but rather darkness visible, and also this description of death. This is a sublime portrait. It's also a theologically rich portrait in the sense it portrays evil, but that is not what is mentioned in the 18th century when they talk about the sublime. They simply talk about the empirical phenomena, which is itself arresting, even without the theological dimension. I would further add, they don't pick up the theological dimension at all, and neither do the Romantics, and neither do contemporary readers, and that's because they don't think theologically, and they simply can't see it. And this is a great problem for us, and I think it immeasurably impoverishes our reading of the text not to see what Milton is trying to say by these things.
Do you think that at least amongst the initial individuals who approach these scenes, these passages from a purely aesthetic, sublime perspective, that they are willfully divorcing that conversation from its theological concerns, or do you think it is pure ignorance amongst the initial individuals who got that ball rolling?
I don't think it's intentional, although it's hard for me to say. I will say that these are famous men of letters, Joseph Addison and The Spectator. Edmund Burke, in his treatise on the Sublime and the Beautiful, Philosophical Inquiry, the latter of which I teach in my literary theory class, I think he does not see it. He does not comment on it. It does not interest him. Very interesting, since Burke is considered to be the father of modern political conservatism.
That's right.
But he separates it as an empirical phenomena and does not see any theological. And my argument in my lit theory class is the consequences of Burke's error, which Immanuel Kant repeats, by the way, is the divorce of being from goodness and so forth, and God's presence in modern thinking. I think it's a vast and huge error that has been repeated by successive countless generations. But that's my own take on it, and I've not read it elsewhere. That's my take.
Yeah, my thinking here is that actually the ground would have been prepared for such a divorce between being and not spirit but theology by the 18th century. This
Yep.
would be,
that's Addison's early 18th century.
yeah.
And Burke
So
is 1757.
if you know your worldviews and the philosophies behind the worldviews of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, then this is the kind of thing that perhaps you can predict, or at least you can begin testing to see precisely where that comes from. But yeah, there is something willful at points about, I don't know if, I'm still not sure if I want to call it ignorance, but I do
I'm
think
not sure
that,
I do either, but it's the thing that I can demonstrate is that it is ignorant.
yeah, of course, we mustn't make the argument from ignorance. But
But on the other hand, the vast significance of it is so great that it's very difficult to ascribe pure ignorance to something so momentous as this. It's a conscious over or almost contempt for what is considered to be important or vital in Milton. It's like, oh yes, that's that theological stuff that motivated him, but we can look at it devoid of that, and we really lose very little. We can just hold on to it. So it is the deist movement, as you say.
yeah,
um,
and go ahead.
and it leads to other serious problems thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, the names you're mentioning here, these are not ignorant, uncultured,
No,
uneducated people.
on
These
the
are
contrary.
I have a lot of admiration in a lot of ways for Burke. He's one of my favorite political philosophers.
Sure.
But nevertheless, as you say, the consequences of this are difficult to exaggerate. And of course, you as somebody who has a lot of experience with the Romantics are in an excellent position to see the nuances of the ramifications
Well,
that
let
come
me
out
give
of
you
this.
one of them, Bill. He distinguishes the sublime from the beautiful, and
Mm,
he says that the sublime and the beautiful are utterly distinct experiences. They have nothing to do with one another. In other words, so the sublime isn't the highest degree of beauty. It has no relation to beauty. Well, beauty, which is one of the divine transcendental attributes, is now of no importance. Modern
yeah.
art moves down the path of ugliness and horror fiction emerges out of this. And the consequences, again, are momentous.
Yeah. I
I need
mean,
to write a book on this. I've been saying this for many years.
well, you see, I mean, a lot of people don't understand why extremely influential philosophers in the 20th century, like Theodor Adorno, were
Yep.
able to say that beauty is no longer essentially a going concern in the advance of art. First of all, as if art advanced and evolved and was getting better year by year. Have a look around you, folks. Second of all, a lot of people don't understand why he said that, because that was a very influential assertion by Adorno.
Sure.
And you again, you can go to a lot of art exhibits nowadays and see the consequences of that assertion. They've been played out. But we have to understand, and you're in an excellent position intellectually to understand that, again, there's a long buildup to assertions like that at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century as we move into the modern age. And you're tracing us some of the roots right here. And what
Yes.
is the antidote to that, or at least a partial antidote to that? It's a strong welding together once more on the part of the modern reader's understanding of the relationship between aesthetics on the one hand, beauty very particularly, and theological assertions that have undergirded that since the beginning of Christianity almost.
So beauty goes together with truth and goodness.
Well,
and
yes.
and those things have been separated, and they do separate in the 18th century, and by the 19th century they've gone so far apart that there's no connection underlying them anymore, really, or there's attempts to reunite them but utterly failing, such that moral judgments are seen as subjective, and the
Yes.
assertions of beauty likewise, they're in the eye of the beholder, but there's no such thing as objective beauty, there's no such thing as objective morality. These things are banished and they have no significance on human endeavors whatsoever, even though educationally, in terms of history, the exact opposite would have been asserted throughout the course of humanity, which is C.S. Lewis's argument in The Abolition of Man.
Yeah, you see this with well, when I first encountered the Transcendentals, I was reading a more modern theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar,
Oh yeah,
whose name sounds like something out of a
it does.
Darth Vader kind of a thing. But in any event, kudos to him. I'm a little bit envious of his name.
Great guy.
But in any event, he was the one who introduced me to the notion that the transcendental qualities of God each implies all the other qualities, and you can't divorce them. If all of a sudden you say justice has nothing to do with goodness, as indeed I have heard in certain legal conversations recently.
Well, that's because they're trying to make it so, but
Yeah, but saying it doesn't make it so.
no.
If all of a sudden justice is not good, then why are we pursuing justice in our courts, in our cultures,
Indeed.
in our societies? We are drawn to justice, but apparently not by goodness. No, but if we don't find it good, we wouldn't be drawn to it. And you could say the same thing about beauty and truth, or I mean, it really, pick and choose. But yes, you're right. There's a fragmenting, and these things are compartmentalized. It's one of the tendencies of modern culture. And they are regarded without thinking about their interconnection with the other necessary qualities that go along with them. So much so that you see this another sort of major step in the evolution of this process of divorcing art from goodness started with the French symbolists who wanted to explore how far you could attain aesthetic value even as you spoke about something which was ethically reprehensible. The great master of this is, of course, Baudelaire, who's very, very good at it. He writes some strikingly beautiful poems about some really, really heinous stuff. Yeah, Algernon Swinburne does this after as
Yes.
well, and what have you. And this
Glory
has
to man in the highest, says Swinburne.
yeah, and so you have this. This just basically gets your avalanche underway, and then this is catalyzed oftentimes by two world wars, where we talk about the people who basically were behind them, causing them to be and seeing them through, and of course right up into the horrors of the Holocaust and stuff like this. These were people who were masters at understanding and sometimes even producing beauty. So what has beauty to do with goodness? This is one of the great questions we hear echoed everywhere at the beginning of the 20th century. And the assertion is, quite angrily, nothing oftentimes. Beauty and goodness are these two separate things.
There are contrary voices, but they don't prevail, like Solzhenitsyn, right?
Yes. I mean, people have been pushing back against that assertion as well, but not terribly successfully, I would argue. But that, of course, doesn't make the pushback nevertheless enormously important and vital.
I'm convinced they'll prevail, but it's a long battle.
Yeah.
Bill, look, I did not expect us to talk about book 2 at this length. But I think that we probably ought to leave it at that myself, simply because we've already given a great deal here. And I think any interaction with book 3 would be greatly diminished by a short conversation. We should probably talk about book 3 next time.
Book 3 is absolutely vital. You're correct. There's a lot going on there. It's not just complicated, it's important. And I think we need to dwell at some length. Already we're covering over stuff too quickly because of necessity. We can't help that. Yeah. But I concur with you. I think we should draw a line under this conversation here today so that we can do proper justice to book 3 in our next episode.
Okay. In which case we will do that. We will begin with the another invocation in book 3, the invocation of light. And there we will get the council that takes place within heaven between God and his son. But we'll leave it off with that for today. Once again, I'm Scott Masson, my friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Friesen, and we will see you next time.
Take care, folks.
Take care.